class, as you file in today, you'll notice we have a very makeshift setup, and I do apologize. We have not secured a permanent location for our class yet, and so I certainly appreciate your patience, and we will do the best we have with minimal setup today, okay? Now, as you filter into class, I would like you to stop by my desk and pick up a note card. And what I'm going to have you do with this note card is just quickly define for me some of the concepts we've talked about already, just so I know that we're all on the same page and ready to move forward, okay? And I'm going to get some of these out for you. Those basic concepts will be ethos, pathos, logos, kairos, and I would also like you to give me a quick working definition of the sophists and of the idea of simulacra. Okay, so I'm going to just set these right up here, and yeah, you guys can actually, if you want to take a few, and you can sort of pass them around. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, and then you can just turn those in at the end of class. It's not really a quiz. I just want to make sure that we're all ready to move forward. Okay, so I'll give you a minute to do that while I sort of set things up here, okay? Great. Okay, got pens and pencils ready. Need that. Is there anything I wanted to go over? Right. Sorry? Oh, you can, you don't have to number them. Just any order you want to write them in, okay? Great. Okay. Yeah, class, just go ahead and, you can write those in any order. It's just very casual, okay? Okay. Okay. One more thing, we do have handouts right by the door as you come in, so yeah, please make sure to just grab a handout, and no peeking yet, okay? Great. And those are 2 pages each, okay? So everyone needs 2 pages of handout and 1 note card per student. Okay. And as you finish up your exercises, you can just bring them back up here, actually, if you want. Yeah, I know I said end of class, but let's just get it out of the way, okay? So as you finish, just go ahead and pile them right up here, okay? Great. And then we can get started. Okay, looks like we have everything we're going to need. Thank you. Yep, right there. Okay, is everybody pretty much, yeah? Okay, looks like most of you are finishing up. So, we will be departing a little bit from Aristotle. We will be referencing this text just a little bit, but I want to make it clear that this class is about rhetoric and composition, and as much as we like to study the specifics and the methodology and the various tropes through which rhetorical arguments can be made, and the traditions of ancient rhetoric, this is an introductory course, and therefore I see it more as a survey of language and its power to shape our reality, to shape our perception, which then becomes reality, arguably. So once in a while, I like to step back from some of the technicalities, which are important, but to talk in a more general sense about language. And one of the things Aristotle talks about, and you should all be digging into this per the reading, but he does talk about metaphor and the use of metaphor to persuade and its power in society. So we're going to run with that a little bit today, and every semester that I teach this course, I try to think of topics that will be interesting to my particular students. So I listen and I read your meditations and assignments, and that's why I encourage you to use Aristotle and some of our other texts as a foundation for branching into areas of your own interest. So, in that spirit, today we will be talking about zombies. Okay? Yes, I know it sounds a little bit surprising. However, I have noticed a lot of you tend to enjoy sci-fi. You tend to enjoy the supernatural. And most of you seem to be interested in zombies, in vampires, and in that sort of thing. So we're going to be adding this book to your reading list. Now, I don't want to add on another book, so I do have some copies available for you to borrow and share if you'd like, and this won't be required front to back reading, but I would like to give you access to it since it will be foundational to our discussion today. This is the book I Am Legend, and if you've seen the major motion picture with Will Smith, that's great, but this is in a lot of ways different, and so please don't take that as your assumption, okay? Okay. This book was written a long time ago, before Will Smith was ever the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air or anything else. So, now let me find our handout and we'll go ahead and get started. This may seem like a departure from a lot of the technical discussions we've been having about rhetoric lately, and we will pick up next class on some of the tropes of language used in argument and persuasion. So you're not getting off so easily, but I do like to have a little fun once in a while, believe it or not. So if you can all take your handout, okay, and like I said, you should all have 2 pages of this handout. And the first thing I want to do is just ask some guiding questions because we want to think about everything we talk about today in terms of our larger class discussion. So we will be asking some guiding questions, and our goal today, I think colorful pens will make it fun. We'll go with blue, see if this works. Anyhow, our discussion today can be seen as a way to get your brain working and thinking about language in a more critical way, okay? So I just want you to engage language more critically and learn to do that in the areas that it naturally occurs to you. So first of all, we think a lot and talk a lot about Plato. So Plato had an issue with rhetoric, where he saw it as more of what he would call, and you will often hear referred to as knack. And you may have heard this before, that you have a knack for something. But for Plato, this meant largely that rhetoric, rather than being a real art or a real science, was more of a trick. That it was just smooth talking, okay, and it wasn't necessarily a means of fair persuasion. It wasn't sophisticated, and it really contains a lot of trickery, as well as flattery, okay? And you'll see that again on your handout. However, he did make an exception, as did Aristotle, for the use of metaphor. As metaphor, especially extended metaphor, which largely happened as a product of an oral tradition in the ancient world. So we had great oral stories like the Odyssey or the Iliad that were sort of around long before they were ever written down. And they could teach us things like parables. And our main men, Plato and Aristotle, felt that this was somewhat more excusable because it was a fair fight. It was drawing attention to itself as artifice, and as art, it was more honest because it was upfront that it was involving a lot of artistry, that there was obvious manipulation. And so in a way, they felt that metaphor is a fairer way to express opinions or to persuade, because it is perhaps more transparent and that we all accept it as art. So that may take us a little bit further, and again, these are just ideas I want you to keep in mind as we get into our discussion today, okay? Right now we're asking more questions than we really need to answer. The answers come in time. So we can also think about the function of rhetoric in the ancient world. What have we gleaned in terms of what might be the function of rhetoric in the world of Plato and Aristotle? Okay. Yes, very political. Very political. largely political and societal, of course. This was how you gained power. If you could speak well, obviously again in a society with an oral tradition, then you sort of had the keys to the kingdom. Okay, so yes, very good point. It was paramount in constructing power through politics and political presence. And we can think about also law, which is somewhat related, that rhetoric was very much part of a judicial tradition as well, and lawyers, of course, were some of the first people to really exercise and perfect rhetoric as we understand it. And that is still largely true today. Does anyone have any thoughts about how the function or the presence of rhetoric may have changed for us now? Anybody? Yeah. Sure. That's a very good point. We live in an age of information. And we live in the age of a 24-hour news cycle. That's an excellent point. Mm-hmm. So, we can think about that. In the past, rhetoric may have been political, social, related to law, and a democratic society. Today, we have so much information all the time that we may be perhaps even more skeptical of somebody telling us something and asserting that it is the truth. Mm-hmm. I think, I'm not sure the spelling on this, but Mr. Stephen Colbert gave us the term truthiness, I think in the year 2005. And so we are perhaps more skeptical today of somebody telling us that they have the truth or even that they have the facts. And as a result, I think you're very right. We may not trust, and we may be much, much more resistant to rhetorical speech and writing, even maybe more so than people in the ancient world, which helps us perhaps better empathize with where Plato and Aristotle may have been coming from. And our world is what we might say overly vocal, so perhaps then there is a necessity for a way of talking about things that won't be so immediately off-putting. And we can think about that because we may trust speech and we may trust speakers or even rhetorers less than we used to, then perhaps art itself takes on a more meaningful role in persuasion or in the construction of our reality. Okay? So, one of the questions we may ask ourselves is whether these new sources of rhetoric and just the intellectual noise we hear, like you pointed out, the 24-hour news network. Does anyone else have any other examples? Sure, yeah, just speak up. The internet, absolutely. Prolonged elections, absolutely, yes. So we start to see that there are many, many sources of information, and we may have information overkill. So why don't some of you tell me, and again you can just speak up, what kinds of places, what kinds of sources do you use to get your, not just your news directly, but your information? Yeah, just go ahead and shout them out. Okay. Great. And you can keep going. I'm going to just write up another question for us here. Yeah. Sure. Here. I apologize for my handwriting. It's quite difficult to reach the far end of the board. Can culture carry the germ of rhetoric? And artists and speakers become conduits of our ideas. So what do we think about this? Can culture carry the germ of rhetoric and artists and speakers become conduits of our ideas? Exactly. It is a direct reversal Okay, so this is then, to put it a different way, the idea that culture itself basically has the germs of, or the impetus for the rhetoric, and creates meaning for artists and speakers to then interpret. And this brings us to the idea of intention that we've talked about so often. And often when we think about intention, we think about a rhetor or a speaker having an idea or a cause that they're hoping to impart on and persuade an audience. However, what I want us to think about again today is that it's possible for audience to create meaning and for the intention to be blurred a bit. Perhaps with artists, intention, as much as it can be overt, can also be subliminal. And the reason I want to mention that is because I know that we've all taken literature classes from overzealous teachers who will tell us that, every eye color and every direction on a map and every single word itself can be an anagram and an analogy, and I don't want us to become too resistant to the idea that although perhaps some of the creators we'll talk about today, like Robert Kirkman, for example, writing The Walking Dead, I don't want you to think for a moment that I am saying that Mr. Kirkman's intention is to directly persuade us of anything in particular, certainly not politically, but that certainly culture itself, all of us, we do have interests, we do have opinions, and we do have emotions that form our zeitgeist, and artists can pick up on this. And so the intention can be as much ours as it is theirs, and they are the ones who translate that for us into different works of art and entertainment. So, why, again, getting back to Plato, just to summarize, why is metaphor a metaphor? So sorry. My handwriting is atrocious as always. But why do we see metaphor as such a powerful way of persuasion? Perfectly said. Yeah, that's exactly how we opened. It's just talking about the fact that metaphor is something that we may not shut ourselves down to. If we are being entertained, and if we are sometimes being delighted or even scared, we may open ourselves, our minds and our hearts and what have you, to new ideas because we don't put up our natural intellectual defenses, which we all do have. And fear is certainly something I want to talk about today. Because obviously fear is a key component in our discussion of zombies. And I do want us to think. You can look at your handout for this. But we have some questions here. And those guiding questions I would also like you to meditate on in some free writing after class as a little homework. And those questions are right here in the middle of your first page, okay? So those questions are, can intentionality be intuitive or subliminal? Can an audience propel intention or create meaning, as we're talking about here? To what extent do words and vocabulary construct our reality, which we will talk about specifically? And to what extent can fear be comforting? That may seem like a strange concept, and yet I would like you to keep in mind that we are all drawn to these stories, these discussions, and these new mythologies we have about zombies. There must be a reason for it, and I would think that as much as fear may be stimulating, there could perhaps be a component of comfort there, okay? So, let's get down to brass tacks, or guts and brains, if you will. I'm going to give us a quote. Again, this is on your handout. And this is from Noam Chomsky. I think these ideas are somewhat pertinent in his discussion of zombies that he gave us somewhat recently. So you can follow along on your handout. But he says, I think much of it is kind of just a recognition at some level of the psyche that if you've got your boot on somebody's neck, there's something wrong, and that the people you're oppressing may rise up and defend themselves, and then you're in trouble. And another is the strange properties the country has always had of fear of invented dangers. There is a kind of paranoid streak in the culture that's pretty unusual. And that is Chomsky talking about the popularity of zombies in America, although I do think that it applies to many modern societies and countries as well. So we don't have to couch our discussion entirely in terms of the American experience of zombies. In fact, it isn't where we'll start. Does anyone have any idea the origin of zombies as we know them? Yeah? That that is a good point. I think that Frankenstein, in a way, could certainly be seen as one of our original zombies, back from the dead. And yes, absolutely. Certainly vampires, which we will talk about momentarily. Okay, so those are good examples. I would trace the use of the term zombie itself back to Haiti. And in Haitian folklore, we see the first terms and the first mythologies that are very, very similar and seem foundational to the way we understand zombies. Now, Haitian folklore had zombies and these creatures were a little bit different from our understanding of zombies. They were largely seen as thralls. Okay. Thralls meaning that these zombies were essentially beholden to whoever raised them. So, yes, whoever said Frankenstein, that is a direct correlation. And we can understand that these zombies were seen as thralls, but at the same time, they were raised from the dead. So there's a bit of a conundrum there that we often see and will continue to see, that although being a zombie or a resurrected creature is, yes, it's an escape from death. It's perhaps a kind of immortality, and at the same time, it doesn't come without its fair share of burdens and horrors. Now, at this time in Haiti, the slave trade was in full swing, and so this idea of slavery, of becoming indentured to whoever might have raised you, and oftentimes that was done by a necromancer. Again, if we think about that in terms of slave trade, that means that somebody was responsible for taking these people from the lives they had known and re-raising them and resurrecting them into a life of slavery. Okay, we don't have to go very far to understand the correlation there, and that the feelings of the people, whether they were slave traders, whether they were slave owners, or whether they were slaves themselves, we can see that the common themes here are cycles of rebirth, structures of power, and lack of agency, as well as assertion of different kinds of agency, and ultimately salvation in one form or another. So that's really where we can first start to see the development of these ideas. Of course, like any popular mythology, you can find traces of this and similar concepts all over the world throughout history. However, in America, we did not quite start to see zombies the way we see them now until books like I Am Legend. And I Am Legend, written by Richard Matheson in the 50s, was actually about, and you can kind of see by the cover art here, more about vampires. However, why it is so important to our construction of zombie culture is because it was one of the first works that became very popular that showed infection, something scientific as the reason for the occurrence of these monsters, of people who have turned into monsters. And if you think about it, that is the big turning point, okay? When we go from thinking about magic or religion as a way of understanding the genesis of zombies, and we start to think about it in a way that is very, very pertinent to culture. When we think about the biological warfare, when we think about world wars, different kinds of testing that were going on, to start to think about something that was actually human, that was somewhat within the realm of possibility in our scientific imagination, brought it that much closer to home and that much more relevant. Of course, we also had many illnesses in the United States and around the world that people had suffered greatly from, and so we were starting to fear the idea of epidemic. Okay, and this is the big turning point. Epidemic. And we can, again, all of these ideas can really be fleshed out and understood again in terms of what was happening in society. But just to move along a little bit, that brought us closer to The Night of the Living Dead by Romero. Okay, and Romero took this idea of epidemic, largely inspired from I Am Legend, and he made The Night of the Living Dead. So, The Night of the Living Dead becomes one of our first examples of zombies, especially in film, that are tending to travel in large groups or hordes, and hordes become essential. We can look at ideas of overcrowding, ideas of more limited resources, even the development of a suburbia. And when we think about hordes, we can see how all of those ideas might be relevant. And at the same time, getting back to Chomsky's ideas, we think about different wars, we think about different power struggles and different coups going on around the world, as well as America, still dealing with our own ideas of racism, religious persecution, and those sorts of things. Because Chomsky's idea, and perhaps Romero's idea, is that these zombies can come back to destroy us, right? And so that can be gone into on a much, much deeper level, especially going back to the Haitian folklore. And if you would like to explore terms of slavery and uprising, those are certainly relevant, and I would highly encourage it. So, hordes, overcrowding, uprising, and all of that good thing, as well as, obviously, illness, cleanliness, hygiene, and certainly paranoia. And paranoia also, that anybody could be your friend, could suddenly turn out to be your enemy, you know. You're fighting zombies, and all of a sudden someone gets bit, and they're among the enemy ranks now. And so again, that gets back to Chomsky's point. However, hordes are not the only characteristic introduced by the Night of the Living Dead. They were also the first zombies to be seen as really cannibalistic, and okay, and again, you can be following along on your handout, and so that sense of cannibalism, actually, cannibalism, I think, was a very, very important concept, and that is the idea that zombies aren't just after us like vampires were to drink our blood, but they will eat us whole and entirely. Okay, so our hope of any kind of salvation or immortality is severely diminished by the fear of being completely devoured. And so we actually didn't get the term zombies yet. We referred to them as ghouls, I believe. Romero's movie has them referred to as ghouls. And the term zombie was not yet used in the film, but like I said, we can point to tensions from the Cold War, racism, and political paranoia. And we can see those again, talking about intentions as both the inspiration for the film, but perhaps also the message or the purpose of the film. Okay, so perhaps intention is not mutually exclusive from inspiration and ultimately from the message it teaches. So, getting into specific language, I just wanted to do one fun little exercise, and then I'll give you the chance to explore this in small groups and then in your writing meditations at home. But I did want to think a little bit about the term itself, because ultimately today's discussion is just meant to help open your mind to critically engaging language. So I want to make a list of of what we might think of as our lexis. Okay, and this will be an important term for us. Lexis. Okay, so make sure you write that one down. Lexis. And what words does lexis sound like? Exactly. Lexicon. Lexicon, and that includes our vocabulary, our idiom or idiomatic phrases, and our metaphorical constructs. So, is this something you want to know in the long term? Lexis. And our lexis is created both intentionally and unintentionally. So, what words do we have for zombies? Anyone can just go ahead and, yeah, walkers. Okay. Walkers, and that is largely from, as I said, Robert Kirkman and The Walking Dead. And what can we think about? What does walkers say about creatures? Yes, it does seem somewhat mundane and innocuous without context. It's true, it's less threatening. And why would we use less threatening language to talk about zombies? Fear. Yeah, if we were actually experiencing a zombie apocalypse, and I hope we won't, but if we were, it would seem to behoove us to not call them something like zombies or even ghouls or monsters that might seem scary. Calling them walkers in some way diminishes or takes away from the fear, and so it does seem like something quite realistic that privileges the point of view of the survivors and what they might actually call zombies were it to happen. So, yeah. Okay. Lurkers and biters. And I think lurkers and biters. And again, those two I know are used in The Walking Dead, but these all point to something. They all have in common that action is how we define these creatures. Okay? We define them by what they do. They walk, they lurk, they bite. And so many zombie terms are determined by action, and we may fear what they do and what they're capable of more than what they are. So it becomes perhaps more visceral and less philosophical, which seems like the way that human beings and our modern Lexis, which is quite casual, might privilege in an emergency. So I find these actually quite realistic to how people might actually talk. And of course it's less uniform and it's less scientific or medically influenced. And in that same tradition, we also have words like geeks or freaks, all kinds of things that it seems like in different video games and different comics and movies, sometimes we call zombies, or I should say characters call zombies, names that are almost a little bit comical. And again, we can see this as a way of reducing fear, but also perhaps something that is tongue-in-cheek, that is a bit sophomoric even, a bit juvenile, and so it verbally again gives less power to the creatures and provides maybe a little bit of humor that might be released. So, the undead, that's a great one. Thank you. The undead. And this is something that sounds mythical. It is given the article, and therefore it sounds perhaps more epic. An undead. We are defining them instead of by what they do, we are defining them by what they are not. So immediately we see ideas of inversion and perversion. Okay, and so this is a very, very interesting way of referring to them, and does privilege perhaps the slight knowledge that they are not dead when they should be, and so it is quite frightening when you think about that. The same way we use the article here, we use the article in, as I've already said, the living dead, the walking dead. That's a W. That's a D. The walking, D-W-D, the walking dead. we see again the article adds formality, but it also speaks of the collective, that they are not defined by individualism or individuality, which are again themes that you might think of. To what degree does a horde or a group as the sort of ultimate fear say about our fears in our society now, or the creators of these comics, the creators of these movies, why are they telling us to fear something collective, something larger than ourselves? Does it say something about what we want to be, or does it say something about what we are afraid to become? And then similarly, so we have collective, and we also can think of the undead, the living dead, in the same group as this term, the infected. The infected is, I know, used commonly in, say, the video game series Left 4 Dead, and it is sort of what Richard Matheson was getting at as well. And of course he doesn't call them zombies, and of course they really are vampires, but functionally they are our prototype for zombies. But infection is something more and more that seems to be a theme and is a more common way of referring to zombies. It is more scientific. It sounds perhaps more rational, and at the same time, this could provide us with an idea of hope, which may seem a bit strange to you. However, if something is infected, there is then, rhetorically speaking, a potential for a cure. And it also means that perhaps if they are infected, this is a disease more than it is a creature, which means that we still humanize the zombies a little bit more than with some of these other terms, and it creates this potential for a cure, for a way out, and for some kind of happy ending. So we see here a range from almost silly to near reverential, and it's exactly this range of language that I want you to start thinking about in your daily life, whether you're thinking about zombies or whether you're thinking about the way we refer to political candidates, about the way we refer to nations, or even terrorist groups, various organizations, different movements of thought and of protest, okay? And so I want you to start thinking about different groups, and maybe the different things that we call them, and the different names that they have, both willingly and unwillingly, okay? And I'd like to go over one more time just the guiding questions I have for us today, and then you'll be free to head out or to stay and discuss a little bit with your classmates. But I would like you to think about this and write about this tonight, okay? So let me give you some guiding thoughts. And again, I hope this has been entertaining a little bit. But remember that we need to couch them in terms of our larger discussion of language and rhetoric. So, why employ metaphor? Aristotle tells us that metaphor can convince without exposing the objective of persuasion. Therefore, our minds may be more open and we may take more pleasure in learning. Pleasure is perhaps more likely to encourage retention and further investigation. And finally, audience, okay? And we are largely concerned with audience. Okay? So audience is an important theme today. Intention is an important theme as always. And today I really want you to nail the idea of lexis, of what it includes, and of how that might function for us today. However, to finish up, audience, being a chief concern of rhetoric, may be reached through changes in register. So, consider the role of comics, films, and video games in modern social dialogues. And when I say that register is important, this is something we'll need to start thinking about. Register. Register is something I want you to start thinking about for next class session. Register is the level at which we engage in dialogue and dialectic. We can speak in elevated registers with higher vocabulary and more academically rooted discussions, or we could talk about things as we have today in terms of zombies and horror movies and comic books. And I want you to think about how register and changes in register in rhetoric can reach new audiences, how certain kinds of register might turn certain people off, though to others may attract them, how the wrong register may be seen as suspect or even arrogant, and how too low of a register may be seen as too casual and too frivolous and not to be taken seriously. So there are no right answers, but these are all things I want you to consider. And like I said, if you are interested in perusing through I Am Legend, I do have some copies up here, and I certainly invite you to, if you've, as I've said, seen the film. Well, I'm not speaking to the quality of the film at all. You may very much enjoy it, but I think that the book itself is quite substantial, and the story itself is not long. It's simply a novella, and the editions that I have include some of his other writing, short stories and things like that you might very well be interested in. Okay? So, I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on all of this. I hope today hasn't seemed too scattered, but as I have said, in this introductory level course, I think it's most important that we ask questions about language that will form the way that our minds tend to think about it. Okay? So please just have fun with this. And as always, I have my office hours posted. Okay? So have a great day today, and don't get bitten.